The sound of a Code 7 alarm was unmistakable. It was an urgent, rhythmic, electronic pulse that cut through the steady hum of a hospital ward. And it meant one thing. A patient was in respiratory or cardiac arrest. In most hospitals in 1975, a Code 7 was a rare but serious event. It was the kind of moment where trained professionals moved with practiced speed. Everything snapped into focus, and the only goal was to pull someone back from the edge of death. But in the summer of 1975, at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the alarms began to feel wrong. Not because the staff didn't respond, or because they weren't capable. They were. The problem was the frequency. These weren't isolated emergencies spaced out across weeks the way a normal ICU rhythm might suggest. They were happening too often, with no clear explanation, like a pattern forming in plain sight before anyone wanted to say it out loud. The alarm bells rang in the morning. They rang in the dead of night. And soon the question wasn't whether the staff could respond, because they always did. It was why they had to respond this much at all. Over the course of just 6 weeks, patients suffered sudden, unexplained respiratory failures 35 times. These weren't patients already slipping away in predictable decline. Many were recovering from routine surgeries or being treated for stable conditions. One moment they were talking, dozing off or watching television. The next they were slumped in their beds, conscious, terrified, but almost completely paralyzed. And 10 of them died. At first you can understand why a hospital might not immediately jump to someone is doing this. Hospitals are places where bodies fail and people die. That is a grim reality of their existence. The problem was that this didn't behave like that grim reality. It behaved like something artificial, like something that had a switch. By August 4th, the hospital's head of anesthesiology, Dr. Ann Hill, could no longer ignore what the numbers were trying to tell her. The volume of Code 7s in the preceding month wasn't just high, it was abnormal. Something was happening inside the walls of that hospital that didn't fit the usual logic of illness. Hill confided her concern to Dr. Dwayne Fryer and Dr. Martin Lindenauer, the hospital's chief of staff, and they began doing what medicine always does when it's faced with chaos. They looked for patterns. They reviewed cases. They compared notes. They tried to find the common thread that would explain the situation. One detail stood out early, and it wasn't subtle to these medical professionals. These patients weren't crashing the way you'd expect in cardiac arrest, where the heart stops first and then breathing follows. They were experiencing respiratory arrest. Breathing stopped first, while the heart continued beating. That pattern changed the suspected cause. It changed what kind of mistakes, if it was a mistake, that could produce those symptoms. After consulting with hospital leadership, Hill and her team were tasked with reviewing every Code 7 from the previous month. They went through all of the episodes, searching for something they shared. A diagnosis, medications, procedures, equipment, maybe a new staff change, anything that could explain why breathing kept failing. But the cases didn't line up neatly. There wasn't any one disease connecting them, or any one surgeon, or any one ward. But there was one thing that appeared again and again, with a stubborn consistency. Every patient was on an IV drip. Then came the night of August 13th. Overnight, 9 Code 7s were called. An unprecedented surge that no one could shrug off as just one of those nights. When Hill and Fryer discussed the spike the next morning, Hill let slip a thought that sounded insane the moment it left her mouth. Could there be someone running around doing this? It was the kind of sentence you don't want to say in a hospital. The implication certainly was too dark, too absurd, but Hill couldn't shake what the symptoms resembled. She'd seen this before. Not on a ward, but in an operating room. The victims looked like patients who'd been given a neuromuscular blocking drug, the type anesthesiologists use to paralyze muscles so surgeons can operate safely. The only problem was these patients weren't in surgery. They weren't supposed to be paralyzed. They were in beds, in recovery, in a hospital that, on paper, was there to keep them safe. The next afternoon, around 4:20 p.m., Hill was meeting with her team when a Code 7 alarm blared through the building. She grabbed her resuscitation kit and rushed to the ICU. By the time she arrived, the patient had already been intubated and was receiving oxygen. For a split second, relief sat in, but then another alarm sounded from a nearby unit. A second patient was crashing. Within minutes, that man was also intubated. Then minutes after that, a third patient stopped breathing down the corridor. 3 respiratory failures in less than an hour, all clustered so tightly together it felt less like medicine and more like choreography. Hill felt her crazy idea from the day before tighten into something heavier, a conclusion. This wasn't a virus, it wasn't a bad batch of IV fluid, it wasn't any kind of coincidence. Someone had injected these men with a paralytic drug. Specifically, Hill suspected pancuronium bromide, known by the trade name Pavulon. To comprehend the cruelty of that suspicion, we have to understand Pavulon. It's essentially a synthetic version of curare, the plant toxin used historically to tip poison darts. When injected into a bloodstream, Pavulon travels to the neuromuscular junction, the point where nerve endings communicate with muscle fibers. The result is progressive paralysis. Within minutes, the victim loses the ability to inhale. But here's what turns it from lethal into horrific. Pavulon doesn't sedate, so it's usually used in medical purposes with other treatments. Using it by itself means the patient stays awake. They can hear. They can feel panic as they struggle to breathe. Essentially, they're trapped inside a body that won't respond. Locked in what looks like death, before death actually arrives. Hill didn't want to be right, but she needed to know if she was, so she tested her theory the way a scientist would. Using an electrical needle, she stimulated the hand of one of the patients, and the muscle response told her what she feared. Before injecting anything, she asked the patient to squeeze her hand, knowing he could likely hear her. There was no response. So she administered neostigmine and atropine, drugs used to reverse muscle relaxants at the end of surgery. And 2 minutes later, the patient's fingers tightened around hers. He could move again. He could breathe again. Dr. Hill quickly returned to the other two patients' rooms and repeated the reversal on the other two men. All three responded. Hill retreated to her office, trying to absorb what she just had confirmed. One of her own colleagues. Someone trained. Someone with access. Someone who understood what this drug could do. Had poisoned patients. And that someone was likely still in the building. Then Hill moved fast. She ordered urine samples from the three men to preserve evidence of the drug being in their systems. And then she took her findings to hospital leadership. And within hours, the FBI was called. That's because this wasn't just a hospital. It was a VA hospital, a federal facility, which meant the FBI had jurisdiction. Agents descended on the campus, setting up a headquarters on site, bracing for an investigation that would be just as complex as it was terrifying. Fear gripped the hospital. Patients and families were suddenly forced to consider a thought most people would never have to face. What if the danger wasn't outside the hospital, but inside of it? Staff looked at one another differently. Every routine action, checking on an IV or adjusting a line, silencing an alarm, now carried a shadow. The FBI's task was brutally simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. Determine the scope of the attacks and identify the person responsible. They interviewed all hospital employees, roughly 750 people, while combing through records, medication logs, and shift schedules. An FBI agent would later tell Dr. Lindenauer, quote, "Everyone is a suspect but you," end quote. And that was because Dr. Lindenauer was out of state for the first several weeks of the poisonings, so he couldn't have been responsible. Soon the true scale of the crime emerged. Investigators identified approximately 35 suspicious respiratory failures over 6 weeks, and 10 deaths. And some patients had been stricken more than once, revived from one unexplained arrest, only to collapse again later. But proving Pavulon poisonings came with a forensic problem. The drug acts quickly and doesn't leave obvious traces after it's flushed from the system. At the time, there wasn't even a test that could be used to identify Pavulon in the deceased men. But despite that, the FBI knew they had to determine which cases were murder. They exhumed the bodies of all recent suspicious respiratory deaths from the hospital, and FBI technicians were able to create a test that did indeed identify the drug in the organs of some of the men. It was now beyond any doubt. This was murder, and it was committed with a hospital drug as the weapon. Investigators then focused on the most dangerous part of their reasoning, the timeline. Medical experts argued that when Pavulon is injected undiluted directly into an IV line, paralysis begins within 2 to 3 minutes. That narrow window mattered because it defined the opportunity. It implied the poisoner couldn't have been down the hall or off the floor. They had to be physically close, shortly before each patient crashed. So for every suspicious respiratory arrest, the FBI tried to reconstruct who'd been near the bedside in that critical span. So they reviewed duty rosters and visitor logs and asked staff for the recollections, searching for a common denominator. the person who was always there. This method seems logical, but it was also perilous under these unique circumstances. At the time, the VA hospital, and the US as a whole, was experiencing a lack of medical personnel. In fact, the staff shortage was later acknowledged in court by the assistant to the chief of staff, Gary Calhoun, who said, quote, "We felt then, as we feel now, that we need more nurses," end quote, as recorded by the Ann Arbor News. Another source suggested there was a shift in which only one nurse and only one nurse aide were responsible for over 30 patients. And if that's true, that is critically understaffed. So why does the staffing shortage make the FBI's plan for uncovering the murderer problematic? Well, it means that a nurse could be on duty during all of the shifts when the emergencies occurred, but she couldn't be watching over all of the patient rooms or the medications closely. Calhoun also admitted under oath that Pavilion wasn't locked away, and there wasn't really much security at any of the hospital or ICU entrances. Visitors and not so seriously ill patients were able to wander around, and yet the FBI strongly believed that proving presence during all the cases would be the key to solving the case. And when their chart kept pointing in one direction over and over again, it seemed to them like they were right. One name surfaced repeatedly: Filipina Narciso, a 30-year-old ICU nurse. She was described as empathetic, professional, and a fantastic nurse who was loved by her patients. According to the FBI's reconstruction, though, Narciso was on duty during every identified poisoning incident. No other employee's schedule matched that pattern. Most of the attacks happened in the ICU, her unit. And even when incidents occurred on days she wasn't normally scheduled, it turned out that she'd been working extra shifts. It wasn't proof, but it was a hook, and once investigators have a hook, well, everything in a case starts pulling toward it. But they needed something stronger than coincidence, and then it looked to them like they got it. A patient, John McCrary, had survived one of the last attacks in mid-August. Immediately after being revived, a doctor asked him if he could remember who'd been with him before he started struggling to breathe. He nodded his head. So the doctor gave him a pen and held a paper so he could write the person's name. Still intubated, McCrary shakily wrote 3 letters: P-I-A. And Filipina Narciso was known to her patients and colleagues with the nickname Pia. 2 days later, FBI agents interviewed McCrary in his hospital bed, and his story didn't change. To test the reliability of his memory, agents conducted a subtle experiment. They brought other nurses into McCrary's room under harmless pretenses. Leonora Perez, another ICU nurse, Bonnie Weston, a nurse aide, and others to see if he reacted. And McCrary didn't. But when Narciso entered, his heart monitor jumped. McCrary became visibly agitated and identified her as the nurse who'd been by his bedside. If you were watching this case unfold in real time, this is the moment that appears to break the case wide open. It feels like the victim pointing straight at the perpetrator, but things didn't end up being so straightforward. McCrary later underwent a heart bypass surgery that was unrelated to the poisoning, and during that surgery he suffered a cardiac arrest. He survived, but with brain damage that significantly affected his memory and cognitive ability. When investigators re-interviewed him after, his story changed so drastically that it no longer lined up with any prior details, and he died before trial. And since he wasn't alive to testify and to be cross-examined, his earlier identification of Narciso couldn't be used against him as evidence in court. So what seemed like the strongest direct link in the case essentially vanished. And before we get to the next part of the story, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking this video to help our documentaries reach wider audiences, and so we can keep making them for you. As the case against Narciso leaned back into circumstantial territory, investigators' attention widened, and another nurse came into focus. Leonora Perez, also in her 30s, who worked in the ICU as well. Like Narciso, she had access and proximity. Initially, she wasn't a target, but a patient named Richard Neely told agents that before he suffered a respiratory arrest, he saw Perez inject something into his IV tube. It was a serious allegation, but Neely's memory was hazy. In a move that remains controversial, the FBI used hypnosis in an attempt to sharpen his recall. Under hypnosis, Neely reportedly affirmed his memory of Perez at his bedside. Fearing that Neely wouldn't survive to testify at trial, the FBI video recorded him identifying Perez as the woman by his bedside. During one suspected poisoning incident, a man named Richard Gasmeyer walked into his father Charles Gasmeyer's room, and he noticed a nurse at the bedside. The nurse's back was turned. She didn't notice him, but Richard saw her adjusting the IV line, and moments later his father, who had seemingly been stable, suddenly jolted awake, gasped, collapsed, and seemed unable to breathe. This was the critical window investigators kept talking about, the moment that supposedly couldn't happen unless the drug had just been pushed. Richard Gasmeyer later identified that nurse as Leonora Perez, and in a lineup of 18 nurses, with 15 of them of Filipino descent, he immediately pointed to Perez. Unlike the patient witnesses, Gasmeyer was healthy and available to testify. Later, his identification became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. My other co-host has decided to make an appearance. Say hi. She's camera shy. By the end of 1975, the investigation narrowed dramatically. The FBI focused just on Narciso and Perez, seeing them as the only people to have had access during the critical time frames. The two nurses were arrested and taken to Detroit for arraignment. As foreign nationals, their bond was initially quite large because the judge thought they might be flight risks. But as publicity about the case grew, a group of supporters created a fund to help with their legal expenses. In June 1976, a federal grand jury indicted both of the women. The charges were staggering: multiple counts of murder, poisoning, and conspiracy. Prosecutors were essentially alleging that two trusted ICU nurses were poisoning patients and, at least in some cases, killing them. The scale of it all felt almost unbelievable, which is why the trial that followed became so massive. As the trial in early 1977 neared, the VA hospital case was frequently in the headlines. One report suggested that jury selection would take up to 3 weeks. When the case went to trial in March 1977 in federal court in Detroit, that prediction proved short-sighted. Jury selection alone took 4 weeks, because everyone involved knew it would be a long trial, with more than 80 witnesses, a dense medical timeline, and a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. In fact, during jury selection, a new rumor hit the case like a tremor. A nursing supervisor named Betty Joachim had reportedly confessed to a psychiatrist that she was responsible for the poisonings. The alleged confession took place in February of 1977, as she struggled with severe mental health issues and faced a cancer diagnosis. Shortly after confessing, however, Joachim was found dead from an overdose. To the defense, it was staggering. Here was an insider with access, authority, and instability. Someone who could plausibly fit an angel of death profile. Surely this would bring an end to the trial, but the FBI dismissed Joachim as a viable suspect, arguing that her schedule didn't match many incidents and that her statements were more consistent with a troubled mind than with guilt. Even so, the confession story left a lingering doubt. What if investigators had latched onto the wrong people too early? The trial was still on, though, and when it opened, both sides prepared the 16 jury members for what they were about to hear. The prosecution set the stage first. There would be no fingerprints, but there would be strong circumstantial evidence that would show that only 2 people could have possibly committed the poisonings: Narciso and Perez. Meanwhile, the defense began by contradicting this directly. In fact, they claimed they would produce 3 alternative suspects who could have just as easily been the culprit, and the understaffed hospital made that completely possible. Over 13 weeks, prosecutors walked jurors through the incidents, building their case incident by incident, stressing the same pillars: the medical certainty of neuromuscular blockade, the 2 to 3 minute window, and the staffing overlap. Expert witnesses insisted that Pavulon could not have been administered hours earlier and simply waited to strike. In their view, it had to be pushed directly into the IV line close to the moment the patient stopped breathing. One of the most influential experts, Dr. Francis Folds, was a world-renowned authority on muscle relaxants, and he told the jury with unwavering certainty that whoever did this had to be at bedside in that narrow window. The defense attacked that logic at its foundation. They questioned whether the window was as narrow as the prosecution claimed, and they offered alternative scenarios. Could the drug have been added to an IV bag and infused over time? Could a doctor, an aide, or someone else have done it? Could the hospital's lax security have allowed an unknown person to move around unnoticed and unchecked? The defense also pushed hard on the most human issue in the case: motive, or the lack of it. The prosecution didn't have a clear reason why these women would do this. They suggested that staffing frustrations and a twisted desire to show the hospital's leadership how this shortage put patients in danger was the reason. As support for this theory, they told how people had both heard Narciso and Perez complain about those staff shortages prior to the investigation. Despite this, though, the theory was speculative, and jurors could see that. As the prosecution brought forth witness after witness, the defense did their best to counter. For example, one witness was a patient's mother, Christine Lash. She told how she'd been in the room with her son William, when both Perez and Narciso had been working with him. While they remained in the room, she left for a few minutes, and in the short time she was out, the Code 7 alarm rang. William's breathing had stopped. The defense cross-examined the witness, and in what must have been a surprising move to the jury, they brought forth their own witness, William Lash himself. William claimed the last person he'd seen by his bedside before he began to struggle to breathe was an unknown man in a green surgical gown. He firmly believed that this man, not the nurses, was the one who'd injected the drug into his IV. The prosecution tried to discredit William's witness account by bringing forth some mental illnesses that William had experienced. But the defense doubled down on this man in green suspect by bringing forward more patients who recalled seeing an unknown man in green wandering around at the time of some of the poisonings. Was the man in green a real figure, or a misinterpretation? Could it be a doctor, an orderly, another patient, a killer? No one could definitively answer that. The defense didn't need to prove who he was, they only needed to suggest that uncertainty existed in terms of the nurse's guilt. There was also Bonnie Weston, one of the nurse aides who was in the pseudo lineup for McCrary. She was someone the defense had suggested was the second of their 3 alternative suspects. Her witness statement, as it was recorded at the grand jury trial, had changed, making her look untrustworthy. In another unexpected twist, however, Weston was promised immunity from any wrongdoing if she testified for the prosecution. Her statements pointed the finger at Narciso, suggesting that she'd seen Narciso at the bedside of multiple patients before their breathing stopped. Outside the courtroom, the case became emotionally charged in a different way. Narciso and Perez were Filipino nurses at a time when international recruitment was filling American hospital shortages. Public commentary around the case included racist rhetoric that became part of the public record, language that didn't go to the jury but shaped the atmosphere. Supporters rallied behind the nurses. Fundraisers raised significant money in support of them, both locally and internationally in the Philippines. Locally, in a community still shaped by Vietnam-era distrust of institutions, many people were skeptical of federal authority and skeptical of the FBI's certainty. Inside the courtroom, though, the jury was repeatedly instructed to set all of that aside and focus on evidence alone. As the trial neared its end, the defense faced a strategic risk. They had originally planned not to put Narciso and Perez on the stand, trusting the prosecution couldn't clear the hurdle of beyond a reasonable doubt. But after weeks of testimony and charts and expert certainty, their attorneys feared the jury might see the defendants as abstractions, just names on a schedule, unless they heard their voices directly. So they made a gamble. They put both of the women on the stand. Under intense cross-examination, both appeared to be nervous and cautious. English wasn't their first language, and the pressure they were under was immense. Their careful answers, understandably measured in a courtroom where every word could be used against them, risked being read as evasiveness. After 13 weeks, both sides gave their closing arguments, their last efforts to sway the jury to their side. The prosecution summarized their case. The media at the time derided it mostly for being mostly circumstantial. However, circumstantial evidence can still be logical and persuasive. For example, if someone comes inside wearing a wet raincoat, you could assume that it's raining. In most cases, you'd probably be correct, but circumstantial evidence fails to rule out alternate theories. Maybe the person wearing the raincoat walked under a sprinkler, or had fallen in a pool. Neither theory is likely, but both could be possible. The defense reframed their case, which was focused on showing other possibilities for the evidence. The lack of security, the lack of staffing, that created opportunities for other people to have committed the crimes. Finally, it was the jury's turn. What followed was one of the longest and most agonizing deliberations of its kind at the time. Weeks of deliberation. 93 hours of discussion in total. Jurors wrestling with a mountain of circumstantial evidence and the consequences of being wrong in either direction. In the middle of deliberations, Judge Pratt took the unusual step of dismissing one of the murder charges against Perez due to insufficient evidence. An act that signaled just how fragile parts of the prosecution's case were. When the verdict finally came, on July 13th, 1977, it stunned many observers. Everyone was called back into the courtroom. The jury foreperson rose and began to read the charges. In the end, both nurses were found guilty of multiple counts of poisoning and conspiracy, but neither was found guilty of murder. Narciso was acquitted of the sole remaining murder charge against her. The verdict felt like a compromise. Jurors convinced that something criminal occurred and convinced the defendants were involved, but not convinced enough or unified enough to label them as murderers. Narciso and Perez were stunned. It wasn't until they were behind closed doors that they gave in to their emotion. They were looking at years behind bars. Before sentencing, Judge Pratt sent the two women to the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, for observation and study, a procedure meant to help the court determine sentencing. But the legal drama wasn't over. Almost immediately, the defense attorneys filed motions alleging prosecutorial misconduct and unfairness, arguing the jury's verdict had been shaped by an incomplete and prejudicial version of the truth. Judge Pratt ordered a review of the record. In February of 1978, after months of reviewing over 6,000 pages of transcripts from the trial, he issued a ruling that cracked the case open yet again. Judge Pratt set aside the guilty verdicts and ordered a new trial. Not because he declared Narciso and Perez innocent, but because he concluded they didn't receive a fair trial. The issue wasn't one single act of wrongdoing. It was the cumulative effect of many questionable choices, altered FBI interview reports, missing paragraphs, blacked out sections, pieces allegedly covered with pasted paper. Under the Brady Rule, prosecutors have a duty to disclose evidence that could help the defense. Pratt found enough problems, enough small improprieties stacked together that the risk of prejudice was overwhelming. So now the government faced an uncomfortable reality. A retrial would mean starting from scratch with a case that was already controversial, already public, already fractured. Key witnesses were dead. The strongest identification evidence had never really been admissible and never probably would be. Public sentiment had shifted, and the defense, having now seen the prosecution's entire roadmap, would be even more prepared to dismantle it. Ultimately, the Justice Department declined to retry the case. In March 1978, all charges against Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez were dismissed. There was no real moment of exoneration or declaration of innocence, or any verdict of not guilty. The case simply ended in the most unsatisfying way possible. The legal system simply gave up, leaving the question of who was responsible for 10 deaths unanswered. And that question is why this case still haunts people today, 50 years later. If Narciso and Perez were guilty, then two people convicted by a jury, people the FBI believed were responsible, walked away without final legal reckoning. But if they were innocent, then something even darker is true. A killer poisoned and killed veterans inside a federal hospital, and the investigation, however exhaustive and well-intentioned at the time, may have looked into the wrong suspects, while the real perpetrator simply vanished into the background of a chaotic medical environment. The most unsettling part is both interpretations live side by side because the case never delivered the kind of resolution our minds want. There is circumstantial evidence that seems to point towards Narciso and Perez, but there are also gaps large enough to let doubt breathe. There were alternative threads: Joachim's alleged confession, the man in green, the shifting witness accounts, the hazards of faulty memory, and hypnosis. None of these threads tied themselves into any neat bow. Narciso and Perez reportedly resumed nursing careers elsewhere, and they disappeared from the spotlight. They never publicly spoke about the story. The families of the victims never received a definitive courtroom answer about who took their loved ones from them in a place meant to heal. And the VA hospital was left with a scar, the knowledge that an environment built on trust can become a weapon if the wrong person understands how it works. One silver lining did come from this case, however. In the 1976 Annual Veterans Administration Report, new security measures for the storage of dangerous medications were addressed. Never again would access to drugs like Pavilon be as simple as they were in that hospital setting. 50 years later, it's still a case that forces a blunt, uncomfortable choice on anyone who hears it. Either the system nearly collapsed under the weight of a complicated truth, and still managed to find the right people, only to lose them because of misconduct, or the system did what systems sometimes do under pressure. It picked the most plausible explanation and pushed forward even as the uncertainty remained. So who do you think was responsible? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. From what I've gathered about this case, I think Narciso and Perez were innocent, maybe scapegoated at a time when anti-Asian sentiment had risen after World War II and Vietnam. I think the likeliest suspect is Betty Joachim, who confessed before. And as a supervisor, she'd have likely had access to the unsecured medication and been able to walk around without questioning. Of course, the man in green, who we know nothing more about, is another interesting theory. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. And thank you all so much for your support on our previous video. Canadians, I see you and I hear you about the pronunciation. And next time we visit one of your cities, we'll do better. As a veteran, this story matters to me because it speaks about those who came before me. People who, in many cases, were failed by the very system meant to protect them. When I returned from Iraq, there were no mental health debriefings. I wasn't screened for PTSD. I wasn't educated about it. I finished my enlistment, and then in many ways, the government forgot about me. Years later, for instance, when burn pit exposure finally gained attention and a registry was created, I didn't hear about it from the VA or the military. I found out about it on Google, on my own. I still live with the effects of PTSD from that war. Some of my peers were fortunate enough to come home unscathed, and many have it worse than I do. Many of us left pieces of ourselves behind that will never be recovered. If telling this story helps bring any awareness to veterans who are suffering in silence or being forgotten by the system, then it's worth telling.